Welcome back to the Practically Pastoring Podcast. My name is Frank, and I'm glad that you're here. Hey, I'm by myself. None of the other guys are here. We are hoping that you are enjoying a good Labor Day weekend. Hopefully that even though you worked yesterday, hopefully that you have spent some time today not looking at emails, not looking at anything. Hopefully you spend this Monday on Labor Day just enjoying time with friends or family and kind of just resting from everything. But we wanted to give you another episode, but not a traditional episode. We wanted to give you an episode from our archive, but not an archive episode from the Practically Pastoring podcast, but one from our network, the What is the Campus Pastor podcast. So I hosted a podcast. It was a short podcast, only a little over 10 episodes, called What is a Campus Pastor? And basically, I wanted to give you what I learned from my sabbatical meeting with other campus pastors and kind of just dump it into a podcast so other multi-site churches, campus pastors can benefit from whatever I learned from. And so I wanted to get you guys an episode to listen to with a pastor named Andy Addis. He was one of my favorite interviews. It was a different kind of interview because he was a lead pastor of a large multi-site church throughout Kansas. And what makes this episode really, really interesting is he talks about multi-site church from rural churches perspective. Like, how does a multi-site church function in mostly rural areas and rural area needs? And it was a really, really interesting, illuminating podcast that I want you to listen to, even if you're not in multi-site, even if you're not a campus pastor, even if you have no desire to ever be in multi-site or be a campus pastor. I think this podcast was really interesting. He talks about a lot of stuff about for smaller churches or rural churches. That's really interesting. He talks about some of the complexities of what it means to be a pastor in those areas. But towards the end of the episode, he talks about sabbatic rhythms. And that might be a phrase you've never heard before. It was a phrase I've never heard before until I got to know Andy a little bit better. He wrote this book about rest and sabbatic rhythms that you put in your calendar. And if you are a lead pastor, you kind of put it in the calendar for your staff and for everybody so that pastors don't burn out. And I thought, this was a good episode to talk about multi-site, to talk about campus pastor stuff, but the aspect of sabbatic rhythms, not just having one sabbatical every 7 to 10 years, but having sabbatic rhythms every week, every month, every year is huge that he talks about, and it's impacted me in trying to rethink how I look at my calendar and how I hope to in the churches I get to be a part of, and the churches I get to have any influence over. Hopefully, they get to have these type of sabbatic rhythms in there as well. So check out this podcast. It's a bonus episode on this special holiday weekend. Hopefully you enjoy it. But before we dive into the episode and hear from Andy, I want to remind you the Practically Pastoring Conference is happening February 17th to the 19th next year in 2025. It's only $39. That's so cheap. Please, 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 we would love for you to show up, be there. We have things for ministry spouses. We'll have childcare when we have that event for the ministry spouses at the conference. We got a special guest speaker that we're really excited for you to hear with some amazing content that's going to benefit every single church, every single ministry that you're a part of if you can go there. We got a sponsor who's super generous, who's going to hook up everybody with some amazing swag. We got books that we're going to give out. It's going to be a great conference. It's only $39. $39. So affordable. So we would love to see you there. PracticallyPastoringConference.com. Go to the website. If you have any questions, slide into the DMs of any of the other guys besides me on our podcast. We would love to see you there. All right. Hopefully you enjoyed this episode. Until next week, see you later. Bye.
I am so excited about this episode. Usually, so for this podcast, I've been trying to avoid getting non-campus pastors. I want to avoid getting the senior pastors because, so I feel like for a little bit for campus pastors, this is a little bit of an in-house conversation that we want to have a safe space to maybe even talk about some of the complexities between being a campus pastor and some of the folks that are in the central seats in their churches. But Andy here is someone that I have been kind of watching from a distance. He speaks at my denomination's kind of regional conference, and I've been fascinated not just with his ministry, some of the books that he's written, but also specifically the fact that you are the lead pastor of a rural multi-site church in Kansas. And I just want to that blows my mind. I want to talk about that. So Andy, I'm glad that you're here. Please introduce yourselves. Tell us about your church, how long you've been there, all that kind of stuff.
Fantastic. It is a privilege for me to be here. And yeah, there is a difference between the hard labor of being a location pastor, campus pastor, and very often other guys in the network. So I feel that weight, and we want to talk about that before we get there. I am Andy Addis. I pastor a church called Crosspoint. We are a rural multi-site network, and last November crossed the partial finish line of 20 years of service in this place. I've only pastored 2 churches in my life, one when I was in seminary and this one. I came here, this is 60 miles from where I grew up. I have a heart for this place, but I also had a couple little boys, and we were in the heart of Fort Worth, Texas, and wanted to go back home to raise them and be near family. And so went to, the church was originally named Westbrook Baptist Church, and it was a dying neighborhood church that had the octagonal building with the burnt orange carpet and the wooden pews. Hallelujah, or you know. But they had saw their heyday in the mid-'90s, been without a pastor for a couple years, really had only a handful of people left. Cut to the chase on this without telling you the story in between. To God be the glory on this, because I didn't have a plan. Matter of fact, we talk about the early years at Crosspoint as a rodeo. We rode a bull. If you hold on for 8 seconds, you win. That was about all we did. Everything we have to share is from looking back and going, isn't God good? But that little handful of people in the dying church came through a revitalization. We started to see a need for space, couldn't afford it because we're a rural blue-collar church. So we bought an existing structure, an old Big A auto parts store, cut a hole in the wall, called it a cafe, put a stage in the corner, called it a church. It started to grow. Then people started coming in from about 20 miles away. We said, hey, let's do this in the high school gym over there. And we became a video-driven rural multi-site that as of this point at this recording, we have 13 locations, about 2,500 to 3,000 in attendance, featuring some large locations and small locations. And we have at least one in the pipe works to start up this year, and probably 1 or 2 more next year.
It's so fascinating because as I've been talking to a lot of multi-site churches, and even like in my context where I'm at, we've been wrestling with the concept of how multi-site seems to function better in suburban areas and not so much in like inner city areas. And we recorded an episode with folks in Fort Worth who their multi-site is like centralized in the city. Or I mean, it's like the suburbs, but like they have some campuses that rub against the rural area, and so it's interesting to hear like the multi-site is functioning well in a multi-site section. Before we talk about maybe the complexities of multi-site in a rural area, give me some logistics in terms of how your multi-site model works. So you just said you're 13 locations, working on your 14th. You said that the first satellite campus was a video venue. Are they all video venues? Is there ever live preaching? How often is there live preaching? Are the campus pastors preaching? Those type of questions. And then if you know the staffing structure at the campus, if it's like the campus pastor is the boss of that campus, or is there like a central influence and stuff? All those kind of nitty gritty details that could help us understand what your church is like.
Absolutely. Let's begin with philosophical understanding, because I think when people say today multi-site, they say nothing, because it's so many different things. So you really have to define what multi-site is. And I believe personally there are 2 camps. So if we can go by this definition, this will help me define who we are. There is a multi-site that is church expansion. And that's not a bad thing. That's like, especially in suburban areas where you want to have people driving no less than 15 minutes to get to where you are so that you can be a church in that area. And it's a little bit about convenience. And then you're just taking your church and expanding. Instead of building a bigger building, you're adding locations. But then there's another kind of multi-site where it is a missiology of church planting. And that is where you see multi-site not as an expansion of your church, but as an expansion of church planting, a way that you're going to do what you do. That's why, and I'll be honest, we've been both. We started off just as church expansion. We were looking for a way to house more people, and then we had some people from a little ways away, but eventually we became a missiology of wanting to reach the entire state of Kansas with a Crosspoint influence. Our goal is to reach 10% of the state of Kansas. That's 2.9 million people. And that would be 290,000, which would make us the largest church on the planet. So that sounds like an asinine goal, doesn't it? But that's our goal, because we know that we've been in places where when you hit the tipping point of 10%, you're no longer a church in that community. You are that community's church. And so without delving too much into rurality, you're never going to do that in Chicago and New York. But in Russell, Kansas, we can be 10% of the city. In Hayes, Kansas, we can be 10% of the city. And that's when you become really impacting. So the structure of our church, by its nature then, is that we are a video-driven multi-site. Now, for some of you, I lost you right there because video is of the devil. Matter of fact, there are some websites talking about why video preaching is bad, and a couple of them even use my picture, which is awesome. I think that's great. I'll send that to you, Frank, if you want. That'll be great. But we do that not because, and I want to make sure everybody hears this, not because that's the best way to do it. It's because it is a way to do it. If we had all the money and all the leaders that we needed, we would probably be planting autonomous churches and sending them on their way. But we're trying to reach rural places where the truth is a self-standing church. I think the last time I heard the stats, it takes 148 people giving consistently for 3 years to support a face and a place. Well, there are some communities that are never going to see 148 people because that's 50% of the town. That's 50% of the incorporation. And so what do? Do we just write them off? Or we tell them they have to drive an hour to get to the big church? Nope. What we're doing is a video-driven multi-site, meaning that we are looking for location pastors who aren't necessarily preachers, but they have the pastoral gift. And I'll just make a brief argument right here that I think only in the Western church do we demand that a pastor is a preacher and a preacher is a pastor. They're two completely different gifts. Now, should a pastor be ready to preach? Always, in season and out. All believers should be ready to give a word when we can do that. But as far as that equipped, daily pouring out, where it becomes a part of your routine and prep and you can do that, I don't think every pastor is called to be a preacher. So we look for pastors that have an administrative gift, and we do everything else to train them up. A good chunk of our guys are bivocational. We look for cops and teachers, to be honest with you, because they love people. And they can wrangle a crowd, and then we can teach them everything else they need to know. Yet, there are 52 weekends a year. I only preach 38 weekends a year. And the reason is, every other month, our location pastors have to preach. We make them do that. We want their voice once every 2 months, so 6-7 times a year in the pulpit. Most of them don't like it. But here's how we do it. We write the message together. We develop it together. It's a huge development week for us 6 times a year as we're growing in that. And then they are able to deliver that message. I also have a teaching team. 2 of our location pastors cover another 5 or 6 slots during the year. And then they teach for the whole network. So it's not just Andy's voice, but we're developing people. We're developing all those location pastors. And should the grid ever go down and the net not work, everybody knows their job is they have to step up. They have to preach. And the word always is, well, what are you going to do when video quits working? Well, first of all, I don't see that happening very soon. Second, it's going to happen in California and New York. And I'm in Kansas. I got 10 years before that's an issue for me, right? Things roll in from the coast. I got plenty of time to adjust. So that's kind of our format. That's our model. You asked a little bit about the autonomy of each location. We want every location pastor to have the ability to exegete his community and lead well. So we have what we call Crosspoint constants, and these are the things that are the musts. And so we hold everything either with an open hand or a closed hand. The constants are in the closed hand, and it's few things like you will use the weekend teaching on the weekend that it's supposed to be a video teaching. You will use our branding. You will do X, Y, and Z. Very few. But the rest of it, 90% of what they do, please figure out your community and do what you need to do. So let me give you an example. Vacation Bible School. I got some pastors who say that is the last thing in the world we need to do. All it is glorified child care in our community, and it's Christians handing off their kids one church to another. I've got other communities where they say it's not a great big deal, but all of our rural community does one together, and it's a great unifier for the Christian community. And I have others campuses where they say it is the best outreach that we have. And so do it, Pastor. Do what you need to do. So we don't mandate that. We want those to be open hand for those guys to make decisions and lead well. It's the same with worship styles and music styles. We want them to reflect wherever they're at.
Do you guys have like a I don't know if you even use the terminology like the main campus or the mother campus. Do you have like a central staff that would oversee all the worship leaders at all the campuses, or are they very much like that worship pastor belongs to that campus pastor, and the worship pastors in that network don't interact? How does that work for your church?
That's a great question. We do not use the language of mothership because the mothership always becomes the Death Star and everyone hates the Death Star.
Yeah, for sure.
When we first started, Hutchinson, largest and was the driving force, it was the mothership, and they were venues. We actually called them venues. So it sounded like there was this big place and then everybody else was a venue of it. Like there was Starbucks and then there were the bistros. What we found was that was destructive to the unity of the network. So we changed the language, and not just the language, but we changed the way we practice. We are not a church with locations. We are a church of locations. And so like Hutchinson is the broadcast center. That's where the video comes out of for the campuses. But central services that you're talking about is 60 miles away, and the staff for that is located at Crosspoint, Salina. And then we have other guys in the network that have pastors and leaders who have different talents, and those become the centers and the sites for that part of our network. So we really are this network, this family of churches, and just because one's running 1,500 and one's running 50 doesn't mean you can't both contribute to the network nor receive from it. Now, the question that you ask is, what about worship pastors? We want location pastors to be able to lead their campuses well, but we also value not reproducing or reinventing the wheel all the time. So what we have are central teams. So all the worship pastors from every location are part of the worship team, and they help set the standards. Matter of fact, the way it works is we have a lead team, our eldership. I'm part of that. There's 5 guys. The central team is going to go for worship. Is going to say, here's what we want to do, X, Y, and Z. Then we're going to look at it. 9 times out of 10, we're going to go for it. Our job is to protect and propel Crosspoint. So if what they're proposing is still protecting us and propelling us forward, then we want them to lead in the worship side of things. But they're under their location pastor, but connected centrally. So they are a solid line to their worship, their location pastor, and they're a dotted line to each other in the central team.
Yeah, that makes sense. You just mentioned that the broadcast campus and where centralized offices are 60 miles apart. So how spread out are the campuses from each other, either the furthest or just on average?
Well, it's hard to say. With that many locations, you got to imagine Kansas is a brick. It is 200 by 400 miles, right?
Sure.
So
yeah.
The closest location to one another, I believe, is 15 minutes. The furthest location from one another is 7 hours.
Wow.
Yeah. So I take that back. Depends. I drive like an old man, right?
Sure.
So I got location past somebody. Now you can make it in 5 or 6. I'm like, the angels are falling off your car if you're making it that fast. But so we're several hours apart.
And I guess one last logistics question for that: if you have campuses that are several hours apart, how often are there meetings? There are all staff meetings for all the campuses together. Like, what's the expectations for that?
Yeah, there are 3 things in rural work, and I know we haven't gotten to rural yet, but here are the 3 major needs in rurality. It is isolation, vocational identity, and low resources. Everything we do combats those. Low resources, we share everything. I mean, there is no poor church in our network because if one's having a rough year, then the other churches help support, and what we produce all gets shared. Isolation, that's what you're asking about. I'll answer last. And vocational identity. If you're a full-timer or you're a part-timer or a volunteer, you're considered the same in our network. And there's no vocational identity crisis because we want you to know that you're the pastor of that location. So the isolation piece. The 2 most important things that happen weekly at Crosspoint are Sundays, in which we do our services, and then second, Tuesday morning. And Tuesday morning, all of our location pastors are on a call 52 weeks a year. Well, 51. We'll give them off Christmas. 51 weeks a year where we are on looking at each other in the face. 1/3 of that hour is spent in prayer and devotion. 1/3 of that hour is spent in development, and 1/3 then is spent on church business. But not only do we do that, but 3 times a year we gather as location pastors for an all-location pastor day somewhere in the state. And then once a year we get everybody together for what we call all-staff retreat. And we just did that. 96 people, all staff, volunteers, part-time, full-time. We all come together for 3 days, and we play games, we serve the community, we do some training. It's one of the best events that we have. So we see each other physically probably 5 to 6 times a year. We see each other weekly online, and then we also have every one of our location pastors. It's broken down into direct reports to our leadership team, and they make regular contact with those guys as well. So there's one-on-one, there's group, and then there's whole church community as well.
As a pastor, looking for a ministry job is hard. Every church has different processes and different timelines when they're looking to hire someone. And looking for great candidates as a church is even more difficult. You'll get dozens, if not hundreds of resumes, and it's hard to cipher through all of them. But what if I told you that chemistry staffing is here to help you with both? Whether God is calling you to begin looking for that new ministry opportunity, or you are a church trying to hire some folks to fulfill some different positions, chemistry staffing is here to help you land at the right church or to land the right candidate that will last in your church for a long time. I really love chemistry staffing. At Practically Pastoring, we have brought chemistry staffing in to speak to our pastors, to learn how to interview better, to make better resumes, and to have good hiring practices. And I have sat on both sides of the table with chemistry staffing. I've interviewed for churches through them, and their team was really helpful, not just representing the church, but asking me poignant questions to discern if that church was even right for me. And my church has been and is currently using them to hire various positions within our church. We hired our current lead pastor through them, and we're now looking to hire a new worship pastor as well. Side note, if you are a great worship pastor and want to work in sunny Milwaukee, Wisconsin, apply and come work with me today. They're great to work with and will help your church answer the questions you need to not just get the candidates to apply to your church, but get the right person at the right role that will thrive in your context. If you want to use chemistry staffing for your candidating process or want to see if chemistry staffing is a good fit for you, go to the show notes and click on the link and set up a time to talk with them today. If you use the link in the show notes, it will help me and help this podcast. But if you click the link, you are also helping yourself and your church make the church hiring process just a little bit easier. Check out chemistry staffing today.
Hi, everybody. This is Andrew Larson. You might know me from Practically Pastoring, which is one of the other, dozen or so podcasts that Frank lends his voice to. If you've ever listened to our little show, you know that we spend a whole lot of time making fun of Frank. Not because we don't love him, but because none of us actually understand what it is that a campus pastor does. So we're glad that you're listening to this show. But I also want to encourage you to check out Practically Pastoring, because one of the things we discuss time after time is the importance of not doing ministry alone. Practically Pastoring is a great place to connect with other pastors who are going through the same things you're going through, understand what day-to-day ministry life is like, and it's also a great place to make fun of Frank. We hope you'll check it out.
This is a normal question that every multi-site church, no matter where you are in the country, that gets asked. But I think it's particularly interesting that where you are in a rural setting, and you've kind of answered it, but I would just love to hear more about it, is why multi-site and not just, like you already used the term like network of churches, why not just plant independent churches and maybe see your church as like a mini denomination that's like supporting and sending out churches? Why choose the multi-site video venue model?
Absolutely. We could be a sending, supporting church, right? That could be what we do. We could be a starting, sending, supporting, all those different levels. But we do what we do because we feel compelled to reach rurality. And the truth is that in rurality, we are planting in places there's two kinds of plants for us. We plant or replant a dying church. We plant or replant in places where the church could not exist on its own, whether it's because currently the city or the church itself is in a financial position that it couldn't pay for leadership, it couldn't get it done, or it's in a place where there's a need to rebuild. So we need this multi-site network where we are tied together, because we're wanting to go to places that a self-standing church has proven that it's not able to survive, thrive, or make an impact on that community. In the places where we go, where you say, no, they could support and send there, the reason that we're in those places, Hutchinson, Salina, Hayes, Great Bend, places like that where we have locations, it's because they need to be strong enough that they are regionally planting and reproducing themselves. We're currently at a place where we have locations that are great-grandparents as they have fostered. So the larger communities that we plant in are not to be there for just themselves, but they are like the old mission mentality. We put a mission fortress in the middle of the jungle so that we can go out and make differences in these places. And then it's those places that we're making that we're going that they could not support if it wasn't for the mission central. Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense. You've already kind of explained some of the complexities of rurality involves, a community wouldn't be able to afford its own independent church and things like that. I would love to hear, one, like what other complexities being a multi-site church, because I feel like when we have this discussion, it's only founded in the suburbs of these like larger cities, mostly in the South. But like, I would love to hear some of the complexities of multi-site church in the rural community. And then also, and this is the $1 million question that I've been waiting to ask you, is how are these rural folks responding to multi-site, specifically a video venue? It's in my mind, I would figure rural connects to like old-time church, and old-time church means there has to be a man up front that I'm going to be able to touch and see. And you're telling me that, they're looking at a screen. That boggles my presuppositions. I want to hear about that too.
Yeah, absolutely. So I may answer these in reverse order. Forgive me. You may have to come back and clarify the question again. But rurality, one of the principles that we share when I talk about Crosspoint is that if video works in rurality, then video works anywhere. Yeah, I mean, if video works for farmers, then video works anywhere. And I am not a gospel proponent of video. I think it's a tool in our hands. And for us, it's a necessary tool because of what we're doing. So let me give you just an anecdotal reference. When we did our very first video-only location, it was 20 miles away, and it was in a high school gym in Sterling, Kansas. And after about 6 months, one of the prime members, the AD for the local small Presbyterian college there, he pulled me aside one day and he said, "Hey, I need to apologize to you." And I said, "What for?" He said, "Well, because my wife made me come to this church when I wanted to keep going to Hutch where it was live because I thought this was stupid." He said, "But the problem is, every week you get done with the sermon, you ask us to pray and bow our heads, and then when I open my eyes, I look for you because I completely forgot it was video." He goes, "So I'm wrong, you're right, this works." And that's just the reality of us living in a video-driven culture. I mean, if you go to any event that's IMAG, right, where they have image magnification, if you go to a concert, don't pay exorbitant seat costs more than 6 rows back. Because here's what's going to happen. If you are 6 rows back or more, you're not even watching the stage, you watch the screens. They have trained us. That's just who we are. I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just saying that's who we are, and we're using that as a tool. And if you want to know how rural we are, we got one of our locations where every year we don't get money in the plate. We get wheat shares from the co-op. Brother, that's country, right? So you can cash those in whenever you want, and that's and video works there. Secondarily, let me just say this. I've been doing this since, I've been here 20 years. We've been doing video work since 2006. The truth is, I have never had a single conversation, not one, with anybody who's ever left the church because they didn't like video. Not one. Not one. I have had several conversations with people who think we're doing a bad thing, but they're already in other churches and just don't like us anyway. So if I could just be honest, I really don't care because they are already in church. Be a believer. Just quit throwing stones and do the work where you're at. We're doing it the best way we know how. Now, you asked about the complexities of rural work. Probably the number one thing to do video-driven multi-site in rurality is to understand that there is not sufficient streaming capability in rurality. So you can never do Sunday morning streams to where we're at. That's why since 2006, we have been Saturday nights and Sundays at Crosspoint Hutch. The broadcast campus adds the burden and responsibility of having to do church twice a week. So we don't have a Sunday schedule. We have a Saturday-Sunday schedule. We record at a 5 o'clock service. It's a great service, by the way. Let me explain this to you. When you do a Saturday night service, all those guys who say, I ain't getting up in the morning. If they did something at night, I'd go to church. You've cut their legs out from under them. They have to go to church now. And all of your third shift workers, that's where they go, a Sunday night service. So we do a Saturday night service, and it is recorded and uploaded by 10 p.m. on Saturday. So location pastors can download it, put it on a hard drive, thumb drive, and therefore they don't have to worry about the spinning beach ball of death in a streaming situation on Sunday. And they don't have to time to get it in. It's whenever it's time for the message, you hit play in ProPresenter, and you're ready to go. So probably the number one thing with regard to rurality and multi-siting is knowing that the broadcast center, unless you want them a week behind, and that's just not cool, you have to commit to Saturday nights or an earlier in the week recording. I know some churches do it Thursday night. Life Church is committed to recording Thursday night, and then they have no live preaching anymore at all. Largest church in the country, right? No live preaching anymore because it's all recorded Thursday night. The other thing to remember, if you're a video preacher, especially in rurality, don't talk about the weather. Don't talk about the time of day, because it breaks that fourth wall and people go, oh yeah, this is a recording. And never, ever, this is really hard in rural places, never, ever congratulate your team on the win the night before, because they probably played one of the other campuses. And you don't want to be guilty of that. Does that make sense?
That makes total sense. That's good advice. And that, the fact that you have the physical video on some hard drive of some sort, that actually eases a big burden for a lot of streaming campuses, where, like at my campus, at my church, we are having to make sure we time everything, offset by 15 minutes, making sure that's all good, that there's enough buffer in the stream. And man, if there's anything wrong with the Wi-Fi, if it's raining too much outside or something, that's going to mess with the stream. And having that locked in on the hard drive from the night before is actually a burden easer, which is smart. Let's talk specifically about campus pastors. All right, I want to. You call them. I believe you said you call them location pastors.
Right.
When you think of your locations, what are the things you look for a location pastor, and then what are some of the red flags of some person saying, I want to work for you, Andy. I want to be a location pastor, and these are the red flags you see. What are you looking for? What are the red flags?
So for us, because of how our network works, because we're a video-driven multi-site, we're looking for guys that, number one, have a pastoral heart, and number two, have some administrative ability, and number three, are teachable and can learn our formats. I guess under that, then teachable needs to also be a team player, because while they are leading their location, they're also part of a network, and we all have to get along. The way that I often sell it, I've got guys who are location pastors who used to sell insurance. They were drug reps going into clinics. They were mechanics. They were bankers. We had a guy who used to set up Best Buy stores. These are the guys with the administrative chops that you're looking for, but they have this this pastoral heart that you really want. And my approach to them usually is this: hey, man, I see God using you. How would you like to work twice the hours for half the money? And that's where we begin the conversation. And we're just upfront that this is not a lucrative business, but this has got to be a calling. And we sense that you have those gifts, and we'd like to see if you would like to use them in the network. The red flags for us are the guys that just really, really want to preach. Because here's the deal. They should do that. If God's called them to preach, they should do that. And they're going to be dissatisfied if they preach once every other month. Now, some guys come in and they go, no, I don't want that, but then they want to start preaching. Man, do Wednesday nights. Do a Sunday night service. Do whatever you want to do. Some of our churches have midweek services. Some of them don't. Some of them have midweek, but they do the youth. They love they're still a youth pastor at heart, so they like hanging out with the student ministry. Others are leading adult Bible study. Whatever you want to do. But there are outlets because it's their church, right? Make this thing happen the way you want it to, and even grow yourself in that process. We'd love that. But one of the red flags is somebody who feels the need or the compulsion to preach. The reason that is, and this is not a stretch, I think that you can biblically find this, preachers have vision. And vision under another vision is division. Two visions equal division. So the reality is that we need guys at the location pastor level who really are associate pastors. They're great, high qualified exec types, love people, and can get it done. But preaching is not their primary objective. See, I'm the opposite. My title is the lead teaching and vision pastor, and it is amazing that we got here because my primary job is the teaching. Because I'm not a great pastor. I've gotten better over the years, but it used to be a joke. If Andy visits you in the hospital, it's because you're going to die. Things pretty bad, right? But I've learned to be a better pastor. They're learning to be better preachers, and we just let the Lord lead us in that middle ground.
I think that's not a uniquely rural multi-site advice you just gave. It's that's something that I've been doing these interviews, as I've been meeting other multi-site churches, that kind of ideal campus pastor is high administration, very teachable, very willing to replicate the vision of the church. And if you have a high aspiring teaching desire or itch to teach, it's not a bad thing, but maybe a campus pastor is not the place for you. And maybe it is to be either on a teaching team or a church planning role, but not necessarily a campus pastor role. And so
can I add in here too, because your observation is great. If you're thinking, I need to pastor a church, but I'm going to be a campus pastor for a while, it's kind of a stepping stone. I wouldn't encourage that.
Yeah.
I think because you just need to trust the Lord and find where you need to be, both for your sake and their sake. Just because it's not a good fit. God will provide for you, and you don't need to force something right now. It's kind of like guys do youth ministry to become pastors. Don't be a youth pastor if you want to be a pastor.
Wow.
Right? There are so many openings. Be a youth pastor if God's called you to be a student pastor. Right?
Yeah.
And be a location pastor if God's called you to be a location pastor. And be a pastor. The issue is I can be a location pastor and get a steadier paycheck at a bigger church than if I went and planted something. Don't do that. Whatever God's made you to be, follow that, do that, and trust Him in that leadership.
Great advice. That's good. Speaking of advice, what is your best advice for a campus pastor to succeed and flourish in their role right now? You have a number of location pastors that you oversee at your church. There's a lot of folks listening. What's like the one piece of good advice besides not making it a stepping stone? What's a good piece of advice for them to succeed and flourish in their role?
Man, I think that it's always to think bigger picture. If you can see yourself as, we always say Big C church, right? Like that we're part of the Big C church, our church is part. Well, when you're a network, you have a tangible version of that. So how do you get up every day going, my primary responsibility is the health and well-being of taking this congregation and being a light in the darkness. Now, how do we do that so well that we can help the whole network? How do we do this so well that we can set an example? How do we use the resource? Don't be so proud you won't use those resources. But what is the old phrase? Act local, think global. That's an old recycling phrase, right? The truth in campus pastor life is act local, think network. And how do I constantly think how this reflects on, is a part of, and benefited by the network that I'm in?
Beautiful. I want to shift a little bit away from the campus pastor talk as we wrap up. I know you have a podcast, you have some books and resources. I have to talk about this real quick, though, and I think it's a benefit to everyone who's listening. The last time I heard you speak in person, you kind of were giving a summary of the new book that you were writing, or it's already been written, called Rhythms, right?
Yes.
And you blew my mind with two other people that were on my staff in your church's kind of view of sabbatical and kind of constant rhythms of having Sabbath rest as a staff and as a church. And I remember I was writing so much stuff down because none of us that were in that room are like the people that get to decide those type of decisions. And so I wanted to make as good notes as possible to pass it on to like our executive pastor at the time, and make him like look through it. And so could you talk a little bit about like your heart for the health of pastors and ministers, and if you want to talk a little bit about the book or just point to the book, just about like what does Sabbath rest and resting look like for the health of a minister?
Absolutely, Frank. I'm so glad you brought that up. It is my heartbeat, and I'm 52. And if I'm what they call second half of your career, I mean, I hit halftime. If the remainder of my career in ministry were to protect the health of pastors and set up good, healthy habits and rhythms, then I would be one satisfied pastor for the rest of my life. And it's ironic too that you bring that up. Rhythms as a book came out last week. So it's official. And you can get that resource and many others at andyaddis.com. It's just my name, ANDYADDIS.com. And you can also get Doing More Together, which is the story of our church. There's downloadable versions of these as well. Some of you need paper copies. If you need paper copies, you got to pay for it. If you need downloadable copies, it's there for you. Let me talk to you about sabbatical rhythms. And I do believe it's unique. I've never met anybody who said, yeah, we do that. In short form, everything was going great. Life was booming. Church was just running the rails. And I nearly lost it all with the single thought, I can't keep up this pace. The book will tell you more, but I literally blowing snot bubbles into a steering wheel between two campuses when everything was perfect. We were the darling of the association. Everybody was looking to us. We were featured in magazines, and my only thought was, I'm running at a pace that is not sustainable. So the church was a fantastic, and they gave me a 6-week sabbatical, I think 8-week sabbatical one year, and it was great. But the truth is, after 8 weeks, you come back, you feel good for about a month, and then you're like, guess what? I feel like I'm right back where I was because I can't wait another 10 years for this kind of break. So we developed some rhythm. The primary one that you're talking about is you should have a daily rhythm, a weekly rhythm, an annual rhythm, but the one that is probably the most profound is the regular rhythm. And so what we practice, the reason my location pastors preach every other month is because every staff member, including myself, has to be off from the church one weekend every 7 weeks. So it's a sabbatic rhythm. So you work 6 weekends, and then one weekend you have off. That's when my location pastors preach because I have to be off as well. And here's what it does for you. It's not vacation time. You have to work that week. You just take the weekend off. It makes you normal for one weekend a year or one weekend every other month. And you say, I don't need it. Well, first of all, you're a liar, and you're lying to yourself. So feel bad about that. But even if you didn't, your wife and kids need this. They need this more than anything. And what it does for you is twofold. When you get in the middle of a hard stretch, you're going like, you know what? In 2 weeks, we're going to do nothing but go to a ball game or the lake and chill out on that weekend. It gives you an expectation. Second, if there is one weekend every other month where you know you don't have to do weekend responsibilities, especially if you're a preacher, then that gives you a whole week of margin to do those things that you couldn't normally do. It takes me 15 to 20 hours a week to write a message and get it ready. So 1 week every other month, I have a week with an extra 20 hours to get those things done on the list, created that margin. And so, Frank, if you'll give me the luxury, let me tell one final story on this. When we first started practicing this, my oldest son was 11. And I remember coming home telling them, hey, we're going to go to Kansas City for the weekend. What do you want to do? And they thought I was joking. They said, let's go to Worlds of Fun, which is an amusement park. I said, get in the van. And they were amazed. He literally looked at me and goes, did you get fired? Thought something bad had happened. We went, spent the night at a cheap hotel. We're standing in line for the Fury of the Nile, which is one of those big round boats that gets bounced around. Everybody gets wet. And we're standing in this busy line, and he looked at me again. My 11-year-old goes, Dad, tell me, why are we here? And I said, it's called a sabbatic. I said, every 7 weeks we get the weekend off. And he stopped me and goes, we get to do this again? I said, yeah, every 7 weeks. And then I had to stop because there in line, just big baseball tears coming down his face. And I know there's pretty girls in line, and he's 11, so I kind of moved around to shelter him, and he just buried his face in my chest. And I remember thinking, a little late, Dad, but at least you got there. And to this day, my boys are 24 and 21, 22 now, 24 and 22. And they still, every October is when I set my calendar, they go, let us know the sabbatic dates. They want to know when Dad's free. They want to know when our family can do stuff. It was a game changer for the rhythms of our family and our life. And it's only one of the 4 components of finding those rhythms. I'd love it if you get in touch. And Frank, if you're in that spot where you say, I'm not the game changer, I don't set these rules, I make the same offer to you and all your listeners that I did then. Put me on the phone, let me zoom in, let me talk to them, let me give my story, and let's get this healthy for some guys. If we can get some guys healthy, then we can get some stuff done.
Love it. So good. So good. Andy, obviously, besides your website, if someone wants to reach out to you, if someone wants to know more, how can they get connected with you?
Yeah, same website, andyaddis.com. It has my email. It doesn't go through any kind of secretarial. It goes right to me, so this is a little dangerous. But it's andy@andyaddis.com. It's the most arrogant-sounding website in the world, isn't it? It's very specific.
It's perfect. Hey, Andy, thank you so much. This is so rich and so valuable. I really appreciate it. And, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you. Love it.